Arthur Dayne stood in the echoing hall of the Red Keep, the cold draught from the walls rustling his white cloak with a quiet hiss. Daylight was fading beyond the windows, leaving the throne room in a half-gloom that rendered Aerys' two Targaryens silhouette into a shifting shadow upon the Iron Throne. The Mad King's eyes glinted oddly when the last orange rays from the setting sun caught them, lending his gaunt face a feverish cast. The hiss of torches and the hushed footfalls of the Kingsguard along the edges of the hall seemed unnaturally loud. Silence reigned, but under that silence lay a silent roaring tension, like a crackling fire about to surge into the open. "My loyal sword of the morning," the king intoned, toying with the metallic spikes jutting from the arms of the throne. The metal scrapes and the creak of Aerys' shifting weight filled the hush, adding to the simmering discomfort of everyone present. "I have a task for you, a most urgent one." Arthur felt his stomach tighten. Beside him, Ser Jonathan Darry stood stiff and silent, wearing a troubled expression that did not escape Arthur's notice. When King Aerys clasped the armrest of the Iron Throne, his bony knuckles went white. Aerys' brittle nails scraped at the flecks of dried blood rumored to be caked into the blades. He was always picking at the edges of his seat, as if the pain of metal cutting into his palm was a trifling matter. "Houses Baratheon and Stark," Aerys continued, his voice low but trembling with fury. "They conspire against me, against the rightful dynasty of Westeros. They spread their seeds of rebellion, treason I call it, treason that must be punished. And I have the name of one man leading them all to harbor illusions of grandeur. That stag of Storm's End, Robert Baratheon." Arthur controlled his breathing, calm despite the roil in his stomach. The rumor in King's Landing was that the crown had begun to eye Robert with grave suspicion in the aftermath of a swirl of events. Rhaegar's disappearance with Lyanna Stark, Brandon Stark's furious ride south, and the tragedies that struck at the heart of House Stark as a result. Whispers of discontent were said to be rising in the Stormlands, and in the twisted logic of the Mad King, it seemed simpler to brand Robert as a traitor and destroy him before any open conflict could truly bloom. Ser Jaime Lannister, the newest member of the Kingsguard, was posted at the base of the Iron Throne, one hand resting lightly on the gilded hilt of his sword. He was little more than a youth, though famously skilled. Arthur took a moment to glance in his direction, seeing no sign of surprise on Jaime's face at the king's pronouncement. Jaime, too, must have suspected something of this nature was coming. Aerys' voice rang out again. "Arthur Dayne, you will go to Storm's End immediately. You will find Robert Baratheon. You will kill him before he can spread this treason any further." Arthur bowed. He wore a facade of stoic acceptance. He could do nothing else. But in his heart, conflict was already blossoming. He had never shirked a royal command, never disobeyed the Targaryen monarchy in any fashion. And yet the man he was ordered to kill had been a friend to Prince Rhaegar. Robert was known for his camaraderie and good nature, even if he had a rebellious streak. That he might rise against the king was possible, given the tension that had been building since Lyanna Stark's disappearance. But to slaughter him preemptively, Arthur gave another bow so slight it would barely be noticed, but enough to show respect. "Your Grace's will is my will." Aerys' eyes gleamed with a wild mix of triumph and mania, and he slumped back against the throne. "Good. Do not fail me, Arthur. Storm's End is strong, but no fortress is strong enough to resist the sword of the morning." The dismissal was abrupt and complete, and Arthur was left to stride out of the throne room, his white cloak swirling behind him. Outside, the air was thick with the approach of night, the wind from Blackwater Bay carrying a salty tang that seemed to press against the great walls of King's Landing. Arthur's thoughts churned with each step across the courtyard, heading for the Kingsguard's white sword tower to gather what he would need for his journey. Later that evening, he found himself in his modest chambers, smoothing a whetstone along the edge of dawn. The legendary blade gleamed pale in the flickering torchlight, the wide fuller capturing ghostly reflections. The sword had been forged from a fallen star, and for generations, only the worthiest knight of House Dayne could bear its weight. Arthur was that knight, the sword of the morning, renowned across the 7 kingdoms for his skill and honor. But now he questioned how honorable it was to do the bidding of a king gone mad. Duty was hammered into Arthur's bones. He was of the King's Guard. He had sworn to protect the king and to fulfill Ares's commands, no matter how dire the instructions. Still, the words of his father, Dayne, echoed from his boyhood. There may come a day when you must choose between what is right and what is lawful. Ares was the lawful king, but his mind, like flame-licked parchment, seemed dangerously close to crumbling into ash. He breathed deeply, reminding himself that one man did not judge a king's sanity. The realm was bigger than any single knight's conscience. If Robert Baratheon were truly stirring rebellion, perhaps this mission was necessary to avert a full-blown war that could spill rivers of blood. Perhaps executing a single suspect, even if that suspect was popular, might keep the realm from fracturing entirely. Yet Arthur's heart remained uneasy. He set aside the whetstone and gazed at dawn's mesmerizing surface. The sword was radiant, even in dimness. He rose and belted it around his waist, tested the movement. There was no weight to it he could not carry. Then, as if in a trance, he closed his eyes and uttered a silent prayer to the Seven for guidance. King Ares did not suffer defiance lightly, and if Arthur hesitated, it could cost him not only his honor but his life. No matter the turmoil he felt, the command was clear. Find Robert Baratheon and kill him. That night, in the courtyard, he found Ser Gerald Hightower, the Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, waiting by the great gates. The white bull's broad shoulders and silver hair were illuminated in the torchlight. He nodded gravely at Arthur's approach. With them stood Ser Oswell Went, his cloak nearly as white as his hair. "His Grace expects you to leave at once," Hightower said, voice low. "Take a small retinue or go alone. Robert Baratheon is not the kind of man to surrender easily." Arthur studied the older knight's face, but the Lord Commander offered no hint of disapproval. He was a man whose loyalty to House Targaryen and to the idea of the Kingsguard was written into the lines of his stern visage. "I will ride alone," Arthur said. "Fewer eyes, fewer tongues. This matter," he cut off. There was no need to speak ill of the king's paranoia, especially not before such devout servants of the crown. "It is best done without attracting attention." Oswell Went nodded, though Arthur could sense the same unspoken concerns roiling behind his eyes. "May the gods go with you, Arthur." "Thank you," Arthur said quietly, and then mounted his horse, a fine dapple-gray mare gifted to him by Rhaegar himself after a tourney victory in King's Landing. He felt the horse's muscles bunch beneath him as she took the first steps out into the dark, heading toward the gate. The clang of metal rang out, the gates opening to reveal the darkened road that would lead to the Stormlands. A swirl of cold air made him shiver beneath his cloak. He set forth beneath the starlight, the grand walls of King's Landing receding behind him. Thoughts of Rhaegar surfaced unbidden. The prince had commanded love and loyalty in those who knew him well. Had things gone differently, had Ares not succumbed to madness, Arthur was certain Rhaegar would have reigned as a wise and noble king. But fate had a cruel sense of humor. Now the realm hovered on the precipice of chaos, and Arthur was galloping into the night with a royal writ to commit murder. He traveled quickly at first, following the Rose Road west to cut south through the Stormlands from a less obvious approach. The main road that connected King's Landing to Storm's End was well patrolled, but it was also a place where rumors ran fast, and watchers for House Baratheon might attempt to intercept any suspicious party. Arthur wanted stealth, even wearing the plain clothes of a traveling knight, having removed the more conspicuous portions of his armor and stowing them in his saddlebags. He would be recognized if he were seen too often. His face and name were legendary enough on their own. He left the white cloak behind but kept Dawn always by his side. Anyone who glimpsed that pale blade would know precisely who he was. Days blurred together, the winding paths through lightly wooded hills giving way to the Stormlands proper. The air was humid, heavy with the promise of rainfall. Overhead, storm clouds churned as if in a constant swirl. It was said that the gods unleashed their blackest tempests upon Shipbreaker Bay, and Storm's End was built to withstand even the fury of the storms. Arthur recalled that the main keep's walls were so cunningly crafted by the might of House Durandon that no wind could breach them, no matter how the sea winds howled. Now it belonged to House Baratheon. If Robert had retreated there to muster men or to prepare some rebellious stance, Arthur would need to be cunning himself. On the road, he saw few travelers, only the occasional merchant cart or a local farmer moving livestock. At inns, he slept with one eye open. Whispers of trouble had indeed reached these corners of the realm. Men spoke of the Starks' fury at the disappearance of Lyanna. They spoke of Brandon Stark's shocking fate in King's Landing, and of how his father, Lord Rickard, died in the very presence of the king. The North was rumored to be stirring with anger, and the Vale likewise, since Eddard Stark was fostered at the Eyrie with Lord Arryn. People were tense, uncertain whether the rumored friction would remain a private matter of lords or blossom into a true uprising. Arthur listened but kept his own counsel. He paid in coin, answered questions about his identity only vaguely, just another hedge knight or so he claimed, and continued on. The days grew longer. A haze of tension settled upon his shoulders, matching the storm-laden skies overhead. He felt like he was riding into a labyrinth of moral compromise, each step taking him closer to a fateful confrontation that he secretly wished to avoid. When he finally caught sight of the ancient fortress of Storm's End in the distance, the sun was just rising behind thick clouds, and a pale gray light illuminated the coastline. The keep loomed proud and defiant, perched on a rocky promontory that overlooked churning waters. In the far distance, he could see the sea smashing against the cliffs with foamy ferocity, sending up sprays of salt and brine into the wind. The main gate of Storm's End was shut, though not in a manner that suggested open siege. Guards patrolled the walls, their black stag banners fluttering in the winds. Arthur approached from a lesser-used path that led along the shoreline. The sky had opened up in a light drizzle, droplets speckling his horse's mane. The wind gusted, bringing sharp scents of salt and wet stone. When he got closer, a pair of Baratheon men-at-arms at a guard post flagged him down. They were armed with spears, wearing black and gold livery, though somewhat tarnished by the wet conditions. Arthur forced an unassuming smile, grateful for the anonymity of a plain gray cloak wrapped around him. "Halt!" one guard called, leaning forward to see the stranger's face beneath the hood. "State your name and your business at Storm's End." Arthur kept his head lowered. "I'm a knight in service to House Cairn," he lied, naming one of the lesser houses sworn to Storm's End. "I've been traveling far from home and come to inquire as to whether I might rest here. Storm's End is well known for its hospitality to its loyal bannermen." The guards exchanged a glance. "Do you have a token or letter?" Arthur feigned a grimace. "I was set upon by bandits on the road some leagues back. Lost my letters. I had to trade a few possessions for a horse." He patted the mare's flank to strengthen the story, though the horse's fine breeding might have belied his words. "If it please you, I'd like to speak to Lord Robert's castellan about lodging." "That's up to the steward or to Lord Robert himself if he's of a mind," the first guard replied. "We'll escort you." They escorted him through the thick main gate. Arthur marveled anew at the artistry of the walls. Even battered by centuries of storms, they stood regal and unblemished, cunningly curved to deflect the worst gales. The courtyard inside was busy with activity. Squires sparring, stable boys carting hay, courtiers bustling under canopies to avoid the drizzle. The swirl of ordinary life in a stronghold at the cusp of uncertain times. Before Arthur could get far, he heard a familiar voice. "You there? Who's your master?" Arthur turned to see a tall man with broad shoulders striding toward him, wearing the black and gold of House Baratheon. The man's face was partially obscured by the shadow of his hood. But when the man stepped forward into the wet morning light, Arthur recognized him instantly. It was Lord Robert Baratheon himself, not a steward or castellan. Fate, it seemed, had decided to test him at once. Robert wore no crown, of course, but his presence was commanding. He was thickly muscled from years of training with warhammers, and his dark hair was damp from the drizzle, curling just slightly at the ends. His face was open, bold, with bright eyes that seemed alight with some hidden fire. Arthur felt a twist in his gut. recalling the mission that had brought him here. He was to kill this man. Robert stared at him, waiting for an answer. Arthur bowed his head to hide his expression. "My lord, I am Sir Roland of House Caron." He repeated the lie smoothly. "Returned to these lands after some tribulation on the road." "Is that so?" Robert said, crossing his arms. "I don't recall your face from the banquets or hunts at Nightsong. What say you?" Arthur's heart thumped. Robert had a keen memory, and this was exactly the pitfall of lying about local allegiances in front of a suspicious overlord. "I am but a lesser cousin, a second son of a minor branch, my lord. My father held a small keep near the marches." Robert squinted, evaluating. Then, somewhat to Arthur's surprise, the broad-shouldered lord's face relaxed into something approaching a smile. "A lesser cousin, you say? Seems we have more and more lesser cousins around these days, fleeing trouble or seeking fortune. Well, if you are loyal, Storm's End will be a safe place for you." Arthur exhaled slowly, relieved that Robert had not pressed the question. "I am grateful, my lord. Perhaps you might direct me to the steward so I can find quarters." A flicker of curiosity remained on Robert's face, but he nodded. I'll do just that." Then he lifted his gaze to the guards. "You two, don't just stand there like lumps. Fetch the steward. He'll see to our guest." The men-at-arms bowed and scurried off, leaving Arthur and Robert in the drizzling courtyard. Arthur sensed that Robert, despite his easy manner, was not entirely fooled. Yet Robert was known to be a trusting, boisterous sort, prone to making fast friends. If he truly believed Arthur a potential ally, he might lower his guard enough to give Arthur a better chance to do what he must. The conflict in Arthur's soul tightened like a vice. Robert turned slightly, noticing the sword at Arthur's hip, partially hidden by the cloak. Dawn, with its pale hue, was too distinctive. He pinned Arthur with a sharp stare. "That's a fine sword for a minor branch cousin. Where did you come by it?" Arthur lowered his gaze. "It's an heirloom, passed through my mother's side," he said softly, hoping not to invite further inspection. Robert gave a short, barking laugh that echoed around the courtyard. "Quite the heirloom indeed. One of the best things about being a lord, I suppose, is collecting fine steel. I have a warhammer made of castle-forged steel. Not an heirloom, but it served me well." He patted the empty space at his belt where the hammer would normally hang. "I don't wear it every day, too damn heavy and too big for strolling about. But you'll see it soon enough if you stay and spar with me." His smile was wide and boyish, but behind it, Arthur sensed a tension. Robert was not ignorant. His eyes roved over Arthur's stance, measuring him. "I would be honored to spar," Arthur managed. A part of him recoiled at the thought of crossing blades in practice with the very man he was sent to kill. In a fair fight, Arthur believed he would have the advantage, but Robert's strength was legendary. The man was unstoppable with that hammer. The fight would be brutal. "When time allows," Arthur added, glancing around for the returning guards. But Robert, in his typical manner, seemed to disregard caution. "Time's a strange thing these days. We might have too much of it or too little. These storms could rage tomorrow or next week. Or perhaps something bigger is coming. Who can say? Regardless, if you're from the Stormlands, then you're mine to protect." He studied Arthur again, the drizzle beating on his short beard. "Though I don't recall seeing you at all, not a single feast or tourney. Odd, isn't it?" Arthur tried a small shrug. "My father was always shy of gatherings, my lord. I followed in his footsteps, perhaps." Robert's gaze lingered, then flicked to a group of men training in the courtyard. "A pity. We might have had many more cups of ale together." As if on impulse, Robert gave Arthur a solid clap on the shoulder, startling him. The force behind it was formidable. "Well, you'll drink with me tonight if you're not too weary. Let's see if you can match a Baratheon in a contest of ale." "Not many can." Arthur forced a grin, all too aware that if he accepted this invitation, he would be stepping deeper into Robert's circle, forging a bond that could make his mission all the more painful. Yet refusing might incite suspicion. "I would be glad to share a cup or two, my lord." Robert let out another laugh. That's the spirit. Then he jerked his head at a lean man who approached from across the yard. Here's the steward now. He'll show you to a guest chamber. I'll want to see you at the evening meal in the great hall, Sir Roland. Before Arthur could reply, Robert was already striding off to engage a group of knights who had gathered. Arthur watched him go, feeling a knot of guilt coil tight in his chest. Robert's immediate warmth, that boisterous camaraderie, reminded Arthur of how easily men could befriend House Baratheon. It was no wonder many lords and knights would choose him in a rebellion. He was the sort of leader who could instill loyalty by sheer force of personality. The spark of conflict within Arthur's conscience burned hotter. If Robert truly meant to rebel, there would be a wave of lords eager to follow. But the question lingered. Was Robert already a rebel? Or was he, like so many, simply reacting to the madness in King's Landing? The steward led Arthur through the lower corridors of Storm's End. The fortress's architecture was spare, built for resilience rather than ornamentation. Torches flickered along walls of thick stone, reflecting on puddles that collected from cracks in the ramparts. Arthur carried his saddlebag over a shoulder, feeling the weight of concealed armor clank lightly with each step. Eventually, they arrived at a small chamber tucked away near the keep's northeastern tower. The steward handed him a key and departed, leaving Arthur alone to brood. He shut the door and quickly scanned the chamber. It was simple. A narrow bed, a table, a small hearth. The single arrow-slit window looked out onto the rolling sea, which was roiling under a gray sky. Arthur unbuckled his travel cloak and set Dawn against the bed. For a moment, he simply stood there, letting the hush of the room envelop him as the distant thunder of waves reminded him how precarious his situation was. He slipped off the padded jacket beneath which his light armor was hidden. Then he sank onto the edge of the bed, head in hands, mind whirling with the day's events. He had gained entry to Storm's End with a flimsy cover story, but Robert Baratheon's directness posed an immediate threat to the ruse. Every step from here on out would be riskier. Robert had a memory for faces, and if he began to suspect Arthur's real identity, it could end in a confrontation that might not go in Arthur's favor. Yet he could not simply sneak in at night and slit Robert's throat in his sleep. That was no way for a knight of the Kingsguard, especially Arthur Dayne, to behave. And while Arthur had pledged to carry out the king's command, he could not entirely shake the notion that doing so dishonorably would stain him forever. He thought of Ares and his mania. He thought of Rhaegar. If Rhaegar were here, would he order Robert's death like this? Arthur doubted it. Rhaegar had always admired Robert in some ways, and if not for Lyanna Stark, they might have maintained a steadfast friendship. But that was a different world, one that no longer existed. Now it was madness that ruled in King's Landing, and Arthur had pledged loyalty to that crown. For better or worse, it was his duty. He rose and began removing pieces of armor from his saddlebags, laying them carefully on the table to check for damage. Each scratch or dent told a story of his service, a testament to the countless hours he'd spent honing his craft. He found himself pausing often, glancing at Dawn's pale edge, feeling the weight of his next move. The evening meal came swiftly. Arthur had used the intervening hours to rest, but not well. He changed into slightly better clothes but still kept up the persona of a modest knight. The great hall of Storm's End was warm, lit by tall torches and filled with the savory scents of roasted meats and fresh bread. Long tables ran the length of the hall, packed with knights, lesser lords, and retainers. The dais at the head of the hall was where Robert would sit, presumably with his younger brother, Stannis, if Stannis was present. Arthur had not seen Stannis yet, but he knew of the man's dour reputation. Arthur approached the dais as Robert beckoned him over, eyeing the crowd for signs of tension. He saw no immediate hostility, just men feasting, talking loudly, and occasionally looking toward Robert for cues. The black stag banners draped the walls, and the thunderous boom of surf could be faintly heard even here. A server poured strong ale into tankards, passing them around with hurried efficiency. When Arthur reached Robert, the Lord greeted him with a broad grin. "Here he is, the newly returned cousin from House Caron. Sit, Sit. Arthur inclined his head. Thank you, my lord. He settled onto a bench near Robert, careful to keep his sword sheathed at his side. He was conscious of the inquisitive glances from the men around them. Robert wasted no time sliding a brimming tankard toward Arthur. Drink up. You'll need your strength if you're to keep pace with me. He raised his own tankard and took a hearty gulp, foam gathering at his beard. Arthur forced a smile and took a measured sip. The ale was strong and somewhat bitter. I've heard many tales of your skill with ale, my lord, he said wryly. Oh, indeed. Many a man has tried to best me and ended up under the table by the 4th round. Robert gave a loud chuckle, and the men seated near him joined in the laughter. But you might surprise me, friend. I'd like to see at least a little competition. Arthur inclined his head. I'll do my best, but no promises. He allowed a faint grin to cross his lips. Charm was important here. The more Robert saw him as a harmless companion, the less suspicion he would cast. With that, Robert turned to speak with the knight on his other side, leaving Arthur to quietly observe. He gleaned bits of conversation about the troubles with House Targaryen, about the rumors swirling from the north. Men spoke in hushed tones about the Starks' outcry for justice after what befell Brandon and Lord Rickard. Some younger knights spat curses at the mention of the Mad King. Others simply drank, their faces clouded with unease. Arthur felt a pang of sorrow hearing the bitterness in their voices. He had sworn to guard the Targaryen line, a line that many now called monstrous. Yet not long ago the Targaryens had still been revered. He recalled the day Rhaegar had knighted him, a moment of solemn pride. Now that memory was tarnished by the flames of Aerys' cruelty. As the feast continued, Robert regaled them with bawdy tales of hunts and battles, slamming his tankard on the table for emphasis. His laughter resounded through the hall, stirring an almost infectious sense of camaraderie. Even Arthur found himself drawn to the man's robust charm. If only you were not my target, he thought sadly. He could see the easy path to friendship with Robert Baratheon. Feasting, hunting, fighting side by side. In another world, they might have been allies. Arthur was halfway through his second tankard when Robert turned abruptly, his demeanor shifting from jovial to serious. So, Sir Roland, how goes life in the marches these days? He asked, wiping foam from his beard. I've heard House Karen stands firm with their overlords, but the times are changing. If word came that the Targaryens had grievously wronged their vassals, would House Karen stand idle? Arthur met Robert's stare. The question was pointed, too pointed to be casual. The hall's noise felt distant. I cannot speak for all of House Karen, my lord, Arthur said carefully. But if the realm is in distress, any loyal house must weigh their duty to the crown against the well-being of their own. Men's hearts are troubled. Old loyalties are being tested. Robert frowned slightly. Then, after a pregnant pause, his grin returned, but it was a bit more subdued. Aye, you speak the truth there. We live in uncertain times. Friend, a man never knows who to trust. Arthur felt an unspoken question in the air. Robert was subtly gauging him, perhaps to see if he bore Targaryen sympathies. Arthur sipped his ale to buy himself a moment. Trust is a rare commodity, my lord, but for what it's worth, you have shown me kindness. That is not soon forgotten. Robert clapped him on the shoulder again, though more gently this time. Good. That's good to hear. He took another gulp of ale and turned back to the conversation at large, though Arthur noticed the thoughtful glint in the man's eyes. The rest of the feast passed in a blur of noise and drink. Arthur, mindful of his wits, paced himself. Robert seemed pleased with the mild competition, and though Arthur feigned an increasing tipsiness, he stopped well short of drunkenness. Eventually, the crowd began to thin, men staggering away to their chambers or to some corner to continue smaller, more private conversations. Robert lingered, draining another tankard with gusto before finally standing, stretching his broad shoulders. Arthur followed suit, stepping away from the bench. He bowed his head. Thank you for your hospitality, my lord. It was generous. Robert gave him a sidelong look. We'll see if you think so generous when I put you through a morning spar. The training yard at dawn, friend. Don't be late. Arthur swallowed. He was not sure if this was Robert's idea of forging friendship or testing him. Perhaps both. I'll be there, he managed. Robert inclined his head in farewell, then moved off to speak with a tall man near the dais, leaving Arthur alone in the flickering torchlight. The rush of relief he felt was tempered by dread. By morning, he would have to decide his next course of action. Would he try to isolate Robert in the training yard, strike him down with Dayne in a sparring accident, and hope no one suspected murder? The very idea made Arthur's stomach churn with revulsion. Such deceit would be unworthy of a knight, let alone Arthur Dayne. But carrying out Ares's direct command in any honorable way seemed impossible unless Robert openly challenged him to single combat. And why would Robert do that unless he discovered the truth? Arthur returned to his chamber, shutting the door against the corridor's bustle. The low fire in the hearth offered meager warmth. He stood by the narrow window, gazing out at the dark sea. A swirl of wind rattled the shutters, and he wondered if the gods were sending him a sign. Dayne, sheathed, lay on his bed like a silent sentinel. He stared at it, as though expecting the sword itself to offer guidance, but it remained cold, distant metal. He barely slept that night, lying awake on the lumpy mattress, mind flitting from one possibility to another. Perhaps the best path was to confront Robert openly, demand satisfaction for the king's grievances. But that would reveal Arthur's identity and lead to a fight that might spark immediate hostilities. Alternatively, he could try to gather evidence of Robert's treason or lack thereof before deciding. If Robert was not yet in open rebellion, maybe Arthur could persuade him to seek peaceful resolution. That possibility seemed slim, given that the Targaryen monarchy had shown little interest in peace. But the notion that he might avert a bloody war by talking to Robert lingered in his thoughts. When dawn finally came, brought by pale light filtering through the grim clouds, Arthur rose and readied himself. He dressed in simple training leathers, practical for the yard. He did not plan to don his white-enameled Kingsguard armor. That would be a death sentence for stealth, and the glimmers of suspicion he'd already seen in Robert's eyes might bloom into outright hostility. Instead, he belted Dayne at his waist but kept the blade covered with oiled leather, hoping to disguise it as an ordinary longsword. He knew the difference in weight and balance would be obvious to anyone who held it, but the casual onlooker would see nothing amiss. In the training yard, a handful of men were already gathered. Some swung wooden swords at pell posts. Others lifted weighted sacks to strengthen their arms. A swirl of dust rose beneath their feet, already damp from a night's drizzle. The morning sky was a steel gray, the sun hidden behind clouds. The tang of salt on the air was sharper than ever, and distant thunder suggested a brewing tempest over the sea. Robert stood in the center of the yard, wearing a thick leather jerkin and heavy bracers on his forearms. His black hair glistened with a faint sheen of sweat, and he was in mid-conversation with a short, serious-looking man. When he spotted Arthur, he lifted a hand in greeting. "Sir Roland." Come, Robert boomed. "I'd like to introduce you to my brother, Stannis." The short man turned, revealing a face set in a deep frown. Stannis's eyes were sharp, like flint. He wore dark cloth with the Baratheon stag sigil on his breast, though his expression suggested little joy in that. His mouth curved downward in something akin to perpetual disapproval. "Stannis," Robert said in a tone that suggested tension. "This is Sir Roland of House Caron, or so he claims." A hint of amusement colored Robert's words, but there was a challenging undercurrent to them. Stannis nodded curtly. "Well met, Sir Roland." His voice held no warmth. He turned to Robert. "Brother, I have no time for your festivities. The castle's larders need to be accounted for, and a raven from King's Landing arrived at dawn. More demands for levies and coin. We can ill afford." Robert waved a hand dismissively. "Bah, I'll hear about that later. Let me have my morning spar, Stannis. We all have our duties, I know. Go see to yours. We'll talk." A muscle in Stannis's jaw tightened. "As you wish." Just don't forget your responsibilities, Robert. With that, Stannis spun on his heel and strode off, cloak snapping behind him. Arthur watched the exchange with interest. Tension between the Baratheon brothers was no secret. Robert was the charismatic warrior, while Stannis was the rigid strategist. The rumored friction between them was apparently grounded in reality, though both were said to be loyal in their own ways. Robert exhaled. "There goes the sour face of Storm's End," he said, half joking, but Arthur detected a note of genuine frustration. "My brother means well, but his devotion to duty can be tiresome." Arthur gave a non-committal nod. "Every lord needs men who care for the details," he said quietly, hoping to sound mildly supportive of Stannis, though not too openly. Robert grunted. "Aye, that's true enough." Then his eyes lit up. "Well, shall we?" He gestured to a rack of weapons, including blunted tourney swords, axes, and a massive wooden warhammer for practice. "I usually prefer the hammer, but for a friendly spar, maybe I'll try the sword." Arthur paused, hearing the challenge in Robert's tone. "As you wish, my lord," he said, voice steady. "Shall we use blunted blades? Or steel?" "Blunted, of course," Robert said. "You don't want me smashing you into a bloody pulp, do you?" There was a teasing gleam in his eyes, but Arthur also knew there was truth behind the quip. Robert with a warhammer was terrifying in earnest. He had battered many a skilled knight into submission. Arthur's mouth twitched in a faint smile. "I wouldn't want to deprive the realm of your leadership by removing your head in a moment of accident," he rejoined calmly, surprising himself with the subtle banter. Perhaps he hoped to keep Robert at ease. Robert laughed, a deep rumble. "Well said." He grabbed a blunted longsword from the rack and tested its weight. "This will do. Let's see if you're as good as you look." Arthur drew the practice blade he had borrowed from the yard's racks. He took a moment to adjust to its balance. Of course, he was used to Dawn, which was nearly perfect in his grasp, but for a public spar, he could not reveal that weapon. He moved to an open area of the yard, where other knights paused to watch. Robert followed, rolling his shoulders and stretching his neck side to side. They squared off. Robert's stance was wide and solid, a reflection of his formidable strength. Arthur observed him with a patient calm. He had faced innumerable skilled fighters. Strength alone did not guarantee victory, but Robert was known to be quick for a large man, capable of explosive bursts. Arthur took a breath, raising his blade in the classic guard position. Robert gave a sudden roar and lunged. Swinging the blunted sword in a fierce downward arc, Arthur sidestepped neatly, the blow whistling past. Robert recovered quickly, pivoting to bring the sword across in a horizontal slash. Arthur met it with a deft parry that jolted his arms. Robert's strength was indeed remarkable. Men gathered around them, murmuring excitedly. With measured grace, Arthur tested Robert's defense, feinting high and then thrusting low. Robert met him with a sharp parry, the clash of metal echoing. For a moment, they pressed together, swords locked, and Arthur felt the raw power in Robert's arms. Robert grinned, pushing forward, trying to force Arthur off balance. But Arthur disengaged, moving fluidly around him. A few more exchanges of blows. Robert advanced aggressively, landing a glancing strike on Arthur's side that would have been bruising if not for the thick leather. Arthur retaliated with a swift riposte, tapping Robert's ribs lightly. They stepped back, each eyeing the other warily. "You're good," Robert admitted, panting a bit, though his face was lit with the excitement of battle. "Damn good." Arthur nodded respectfully, chest rising and falling with steady breaths. "You fight with tremendous power, my lord." "Impressive." Robert laughed. "Let's see how well you take an overhead smash." He surged forward once more. This time, he raised the sword high, feinting a downward blow, but at the last instant, he shifted into a diagonal slash aimed at Arthur's shoulder. Arthur pivoted, deflecting the sword with a careful block that almost sent the practice blade rattling from his grip. He stepped inside Robert's reach, hooking a foot behind Robert's ankle in a practiced maneuver. Robert stumbled, and Arthur pressed his advantage, lightly tapping the blunted blade against Robert's chest. For a heartbeat, they remained there, Arthur's sword pressed to Robert's jerkin, Robert balancing precariously. Then Robert let out a breathless chuckle and stepped back, holding up a hand. "All right, that's enough." He was not angry. Rather, he seemed delighted at the challenge. "You've bested me, friend." His grin was broad, though he wore a sheen of sweat. Arthur lowered his sword, feeling an odd mix of relief and pride. A part of him had feared that besting Robert might earn his resentment, but Robert appeared to be the sort who admired skill, even if it outmatched his own in a friendly bout. If anything, the display might deepen the precarious trust forming between them. Men in the yard clapped or cheered, some exchanging coins as if bets had been placed. Robert extended a hand, and Arthur clasped it. "I didn't expect that foot trick," Robert said. "You move faster than most men I've met." Arthur offered a modest shrug. "Speed and timing are often more decisive than pure strength. A lesson I learned early on." Robert nodded thoughtfully, then lowered his voice. "You remind me of Sir Arthur Dayne from the Kingsguard. Have you heard of him? They say he's the finest knight alive, deadly with a blade. But you know that, don't you?" Arthur's heart froze for a half-second. He had to control the flicker of shock in his eyes. I've heard the tales, my lord," he said. "All knights in the realm know of Arthur Dayne." Robert's gaze was intense. "They say Dayne's loyalty is unwavering to the Targaryens, but I wonder if even the best knight might balk at the commands of a mad king." He paused, letting that statement hang heavily in the air. Then his tone returned to a more casual brightness. "Anyway, the spar was fine sport. I'll have to practice more if I'm to best you next time." Arthur inclined his head, ignoring the tightness in his chest. "It would be my pleasure to train with you further, my lord." Robert gestured to the onlookers, who drifted back to their own routines. The yard's chatter returned to normal. "Come, let's find some water and cool off," Robert said, clapping Arthur on the back. "I want to talk more about these uncertain times, and I suspect you might have your own thoughts to share." Arthur swallowed, nodding carefully. They walked to a covered alcove at the edge of the yard, where a servant brought a clay jug of water. Arthur drank a few gulps, handing it to Robert, who tipped it back with a satisfied sigh. The drizzle had tapered off, leaving the air thick and humid. As they stood there, Robert's earlier camaraderie shifted to a grave seriousness. "You're skillful. You're also well-spoken, and you don't seem the typical lesser cousin. Forgive me, but I'm not entirely convinced you are who you say you are." He raised a hand to forestall any protest Arthur might have uttered. "But I sense no malice in you. That said, these are dangerous days, and a man cannot be too careful about the company he keeps." Arthur considered his response, carefully choosing his words. He had guessed Robert might see through the ruse eventually. The best approach might be partial honesty. "I'll admit I haven't been fully forthcoming," he began, keeping his voice low. "My family, well, there's been trouble, and I hope to find a place to stand while things settle. Your castle is secure, my lord, and you are known for your generosity. If that puts me under suspicion, I understand." Robert studied him for a moment, then nodded. "I won't press you further for now. Just know that if you mean to do me harm, you'd be wise to find another target. I've enough men here who'd happily string up a spy or a cutthroat." Arthur inclined his head. "I bear no ill will toward you, my lord," he said, and he meant it. But the words tasted bitter, knowing he was under orders to kill Robert. "In fact," he pressed on, "I believe you may be one of the few lords who could guide the realm out of this darkness." Robert arched a brow at that. Then a slow, confident grin crossed his face. "That's quite the compliment, friend. One I'm not sure I deserve, but I'll take it gladly." He took another gulp from the jug, then wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "If you have sense enough to see that, then maybe you're no threat at all. I can't abide the tyranny from the crown any longer. That's for damn sure. I've half a mind to march on King's Landing myself and tear Ares off that throne." Arthur's chest tightened at the open declaration. "That would be open rebellion," he said quietly, mind whirling at how easily Robert spoke of such treason. It would be, Robert said, voice dropping to a gruff hush. But after what he did to the Starks, the man is a menace. I've heard tell he means to do worse. If they harm Lyanna, he cut off, anger blazing in his eyes. I'm waiting on a raven from Eddard in the Vale. If the Vale stands with me, the North stands with me, and perhaps even the Riverlands. War is coming. Arthur remained silent, absorbing the implication. So Robert was not yet in outright rebellion, but he was certainly preparing for it. The moment the Vale and the North joined him, the conflict would be unstoppable. Arthur thought of all the lives that would be lost in such a war. That was exactly what King Aerys feared. Was there a chance for peace? What if, Arthur ventured carefully, what if, instead, you sought an audience with Prince Rhaegar? He might have reason, where the king does not. He phrased it as a suggestion from a random night, not a direct challenge. Robert's jaw tightened. Prince Rhaegar abducted Lyanna. Whether she went willingly or not, it was a grave insult to House Stark and to me. I loved her, damn it. That alone. He let out a heavy breath. No, I won't break bread with Rhaegar. Not unless he brings Lyanna back safe and kneels in apology. And even then, I doubt I'd find forgiveness in my heart. Arthur's hope dimmed. So there is no path short of war? Robert's face grew grim. Not while Aerys sits the Iron Throne. He'll burn us all if we don't kneel. Brandon Stark burned, so did Lord Rickard. I'll not let that pass. Arthur sensed the finality in Robert's words. The man was convinced war was the only recourse. That meant Arthur's mission, Aerys's order, would, in the king's mind, be justified. If Robert was indeed on the cusp of open rebellion, Aerys wanted him dead to forestall the conflict. Could killing Robert now truly avert the war? Or would it only ignite an even fiercer uprising led by other lords who rallied to avenge him? His thoughts swirled, drowning out the ambient sounds of the training yard. Men sparred, swung practice weapons, chatted in clusters, but he heard it all as if through a haze. He could end Robert's life at any moment, but doing so might seal his own doom. Even if he succeeded, House Stark and House Arryn might rise regardless, outraged at Robert's assassination. The realm could still bleed, perhaps more so without Robert's dynamic leadership. It might become a war of vengeance and chaos, with no clear figurehead among the rebels, and only Aerys' madness reigning in King's Landing. Think on what I've said, friend, Robert said quietly, clapping Arthur's shoulder. You've skill and a keen mind. I suspect you could be a valuable ally. He straightened, scanning the yard. Now, I'd best see to my duties. Stannis will be chewing my ear off if I don't. But if you wish to remain under my roof, you may. Should you choose to fight alongside me when the time comes, I'd welcome it. With that, he turned and strode away, leaving Arthur alone in the bustle. Arthur watched him go, feeling the weight of the morning's revelations. He had hoped to find a Robert Baratheon who might still be swayed from outright rebellion, but the events in King's Landing, especially the torture of House Stark, had pushed Robert beyond any desire for peaceful resolution. He was committed. If Eddard Stark and the Vale signaled readiness, Robert would raise his banners. The wind from the sea gusted, carrying the tang of salt and a faint taste of impending storm. By midday, Arthur lingered in the courtyard, pretending to observe the training knights while his thoughts raged. He found himself pinned by the impossible moral choice, to kill Robert, as commanded, or to let the man live, risking the wrath of King Aerys. And what of the realm's best interest? If a rebellion sparked and countless thousands died, could Arthur carry that blood on his conscience if he had the power to stop it by slaying its primary instigator? Yet the notion of murdering Robert under these circumstances tore at Arthur's knightly vows. Even the vow to obey the king had its limits. Aerys was mad. Rhaegar might have found a different path, but Rhaegar was not here to quell his father. Arthur considered the possibility that maybe, just maybe, letting Robert live to wage war might be the realm's only hope to rid itself of Aerys' tyranny, assuming the rebellion could succeed. But if it failed, the retribution from the crown would be catastrophic. That afternoon, a storm rolled in, the sky darkening, and rain battered the walls of Storm's End. Arthur sought refuge indoors, moving through the fortress's corridors. Eventually, he found the castle's library, a dim chamber lined with old scrolls and battered tomes. Few knights lingered in libraries, and Arthur guessed it would be a place he could find a moment of solitude. He settled at a small table, his cloak damp from the downpour, and tried to steady the tempest in his mind by perusing a history of the Storm Kings. But he could not focus on the words. The library door opened, and Arthur looked up. Stannis Baratheon stood there, face grim, water dripping from his cloak. He paused as if surprised to see another occupant, then let the door close behind him. For a moment, neither man spoke. Stannis's gaze flicked to the book in Arthur's hands, then back to Arthur's face. "Ser Roland," Stannis said, voice tight, "reading the glories of our ancestors. I see." Arthur inclined his head. "I was curious about Storm's End's history." Stannis stepped forward, folding his hands behind his back. "There's much of it to learn. The storms shaped us, relentless and harsh. Those who survive here are forged by the wind and water." He paused, eyes narrowing. "You seem intelligent, more so than the average knight. And my brother likes you." "I'm honored by his generosity," Arthur said carefully. Stannis's mouth twitched in a humorless half-smile. "Robert is quick to warm to new companions, though that warmth sometimes leads him to misjudgments. I, on the other hand, prefer caution." He looked Arthur over once more, as if dissecting his every feature. "You're not from House Caron, are you?" Arthur felt the blood drain from his face but forced himself to remain calm. "Why do you say so?" Stannis tilted his head. "I've been to Nightsong. My father was close to Lord Caron when I was just a boy. I met most of the Caron Scions, second branch included. I recall no one with your face or bearing." His tone was measured, neither accusatory nor sympathetic, just cold. "That begs the question. Who are you?" Arthur debated lying further but sensed it would be useless. Stannis was sharper than Robert in matters of suspicion, and a clumsy lie would only confirm that something was amiss. Still, revealing the whole truth that he was Arthur Dayne would be suicidal. "My real name is not Roland," he admitted quietly, raising his eyes to meet Stannis's unwavering gaze. "But I mean no harm to your brother or to you. I came here to see if the rumors of rebellion were true." Stannis's face hardened. "A spy, then? But for whom?" He took a half-step closer, hand drifting toward the hilt of his belt dagger. Arthur lifted a hand, palm out, in a gesture of peace. "I swear I have not harmed anyone here, nor do I intend to. I wanted only to know the truth of Robert's intentions. Partial truth, at least." Stannis's eyes flared with suspicion. "The truth is that Ares is mad, and the realm trembles under his cruelty. If you're a spy for the crown, I ought to have you clapped in irons or hung." Arthur met the threat with a calm voice. "If I were a loyal agent of the crown, you would not be speaking to me in a library. You'd be speaking to soldiers under your brother's banner, or I'd have tried to kill your brother already." Stannis paused at that, the wheels clearly turning in his mind. "You believe him to be a rebel, but you have not reported him to the king?" Arthur exhaled slowly. "I told you I only came to learn." A tense silence lingered. Stannis's lips pressed thin, as if he weighed multiple possibilities. Finally, he spoke. "I will not expose you to Robert yet. If you plan to betray him, I'll see you flayed. But I sense there's more to this. A decent swordsman with a hidden identity, near my brother at this critical time. You're not just some hedge knight. You might be one of the King's Guard." Arthur's throat constricted. The man was too perceptive. "That is quite a leap, my lord." Stannis studied him intently. "Not really. Robert spoke of your swordsmanship, which outmatched his own. He said you reminded him of Ser Arthur Dayne. And you come at a time when the crown's paranoia is at its highest. So which of the 7 white cloaks are you?" His hand tightened on the hilt of his dagger. "If you are Ser Arthur Dayne, you're said to be an honorable man. But honor is worthless in service of a mad king." Arthur felt compelled to respond. "If I were Ser Arthur Dayne, I might say that a sworn oath cannot be cast aside, no matter the personal cost. But I understand your doubt, and you'd be right to threaten me if so. Stannis's voice sharpened with faint triumph. So you are Dayne. Arthur remained silent, though his expression likely gave enough confirmation. A swirl of conflicting impulses warred within him. Deny, confess, fight, flee. Stannis seemed to sense his turmoil. I can have the guard in here within moments, he said quietly. You might kill me first, but then you'd face the rest of Storm's End. Is that what you want? Arthur slowly shook his head. No, he swallowed the dryness in his throat. I have no wish to kill any Baratheon. Stannis's eyes widened slightly. Then why in the seven hells are you here? Aerys would not send the Sword of the Morning on a fool's errand unless... His face paled. Unless he wants Robert dead. Arthur's silence was enough of an answer. Stannis's knuckles tightened on the dagger. So your mission is regicide. When Arthur tried to protest, Stannis cut him off, voice seething. Robert is already a king in his own mind, if not in name. Killing him would be akin to killing a king in the eyes of many in the Stormlands. Is that not regicide, Ser Dayne? Arthur's heart pounded. He is not yet crowned, he said weakly. Stannis let out a brittle laugh. But you are here for that purpose, are you not? That's what your precious king commanded. Arthur's gaze dropped. He did, but I have not carried it out, because I see the madness in it, and I see the turmoil it would unleash. Stannis drew in a slow breath, his stance shifting. What stops you? If you had wanted Robert dead, you've had ample chance. You sparred with him, dined with him, walked freely under his roof. Arthur finally raised his eyes. My conscience stops me. I swore an oath to protect the royal family, but I cannot be blind to the realm's greater good, and I have no desire to slay an honorable man in cold blood, let alone one who's welcomed me. Stannis studied him with a scrutinizing gaze. So the Sword of the Morning is torn between duty and honor. He exhaled. I believe you, or at least I want to, because if you truly meant to kill Robert, you'd have tried by now. He tapped a finger against the table, thinking, if I expose you to Robert, you'll be forced to fight your way out or face execution. Either path could spark bloodshed. Arthur nodded. And if you let me remain, you risk harboring the king's deadliest knight, who might strike at any time. Stannis gave a mirthless smile. A dilemma indeed. But you are not going to kill Robert, are you? Your hesitation is clear. You're looking for another way. Arthur felt relief that Stannis understood. Yes, he said simply. Stannis stared at the flickering torch on the wall, the flame reflected in his calculating eyes. Then here's my proposition. Leave Storm's End without bloodshed. Return to the crown and tell your mad king that Robert was not here, or that you have accomplished your mission in a way that can't be confirmed. That might buy us time to gather allies. War is inevitable, but if you are truly the honorable man you claim to be, you will not further the Mad King's designs. Arthur considered the plan. If I report back that Robert escaped me, Aerys may doubt my loyalty or brand me a failure. He could replace me with someone less conflicted. The possibility loomed that Aerys might send other assassins, or even large forces to siege Storm's End. But it might buy time, he conceded. Stannis folded his arms. War is coming regardless. But if Robert lives longer, more houses might rally to our cause, giving us a better chance to overthrow Aerys quickly, with fewer lives lost. And you, perhaps you can remain in the Kingsguard without being damned as a kingslayer or failing in your oath. Think on it. It's the only solution I can see, short of you changing sides entirely. Arthur hesitated. Changing sides, he repeated. Betraying my oath to the crown? That would mean joining Robert's rebellion, Stannis finished bluntly. Helping us defeat Aerys. You and I both know the Targaryen reign is ending. The only question is how many will die in the process. If Ser Arthur Dayne crossed the field to our cause, it might inspire others to do the same. Arthur looked away, torn. The mere idea of openly rebelling against the Targaryens was anathema to all he'd been taught. Yet the vision of a mad king's continuing reign haunted him. I cannot say. I need time. Stannis nodded grimly. Time is the one thing no one can afford. But I won't press you tonight. You cannot remain here much longer without Robert learning who you are. And once he knows, your presence will only end in blood. Arthur rubbed his temple. I'll leave then, soon. I thank you for not raising the alarm. Stannis's expression softened just a fraction. I do this for the realm, Dayne. Robert's safety is paramount to the cause, but so is avoiding needless violence. Go, and if you cross us, I will see you ended. That's not a threat, just truth. Arthur inclined his head. Understood. He paused, clearing his throat. There's one more thing, my lord. If war becomes certain, I pray you will be merciful to those in the Crownlands who are merely following orders. Many are decent men, trapped by fear or duty. Stannis's mouth twitched. Mercy is not my strong suit, but if it saves the realm from a prolonged conflict, we shall see. Now go. The next guard patrol will be by soon, and I do not wish to explain your presence here. Arthur bowed, then slipped past Stannis, out of the library and into the corridor. His mind whirled. The conversation felt like a pivotal moment. He had been unmasked, yet not delivered to Robert's wrath. Stannis had shown a calculated kind of lenience, a glimmer of reason in a storm of impending conflict. Perhaps there was hope that this war, if it came, could be fought with some measure of restraint. He retreated to his chamber, the patter of rain on the walls surrounding him. He gathered what few belongings he had brought, armor, cloak, the precious sword Dawn. Then he stood by the narrow window, looking out at the turbulent sea one last time. The black waters surged and foamed. A lightning flash illuminated the horizon. It struck him as a perfect metaphor for the realm. A storm was gathering, unstoppable, and soon it would make landfall. He felt a pang of regret. He would never forget the image of Robert Baratheon's open grin, the boisterous laughter at the feast, the fierce joy he took in a simple spar. In another life, they might have been friends. In another life, perhaps he would have sworn loyalty to Robert. But his vow to the crown, to the memory of Prince Rhaegar's dreams for the realm, still clutched his heart. How could he place his sword against the dragons he had once guarded? As evening fell, he slipped quietly from Storm's End, using a side gate that Stannis had discreetly arranged to be less watched for a brief window. The guards who did see him pass thought him just a traveling knight departing after a day's visit. None recognized him as the sword of the morning under his drab cloak. The rain had slackened to a drizzle, and the wind hissed across the dark courtyard. Arthur guided his mare outside the walls, casting a final glance up at the high battlements. He wondered if Robert was there, watching, or perhaps Stannis, brooding as always. Arthur kicked his horse into a steady trot along the coastal road, letting Storm's End recede behind him until it became just a silhouette against the bleak sky. Lightning forked in the distance, and thunder rolled across the sea, echoing in his chest. He felt the hollowness of unfinished duty, a twisting coil of guilt that he had neither completed his king's command nor fully renounced his vows. He had left Robert alive and well, free to continue his cause. Aerys would not be pleased. Now he faced the next stage, returning to King's Landing with a lie. Could he do that convincingly enough to keep Aerys at bay? The Mad King might see through the deception, or might decide that Arthur had gone rogue. Ser Arthur Dayne, the realm's most lauded knight, could easily find himself declared an outlaw if Aerys suspected disloyalty. But what else was there? To remain at Storm's End and take up arms against the Targaryens was unthinkable to him still. So he would ride back, face the king's madness, and do what he must to delay the bloodshed. Perhaps he could warn Rhaegar in secret, if the prince reappeared, or counsel the others in the Kingsguard, men like Ser Gerald Hightower, to do something, anything, to avert the worst of the coming war. He rode through the night, lost in dark thoughts. The road took him past small hamlets battered by wind and rain, past farmland that seemed subdued by the constant gloom of the Stormlands. In one nameless village, he stopped to let his horse drink at a half-flooded trough. The local folk eyed him suspiciously from shuttered windows, as though they sensed something significant hung about his presence. Or perhaps they were simply wary of any stranger. He couldn't blame them. If war truly came, these people would be among the first to suffer. As dawn broke with a dreary, overcast light, he pressed on, forging a path back toward King's Landing. He felt weighed down by the knowledge of what might soon unfold, by the sense that he was a pawn in a game too large and complex for any single man to control. His conscience provided no easy answers. He had averted Robert's immediate death, but in so doing, had he doomed the realm to the fires of civil war? Or had he, perhaps, spared the realm from the brutal rampages of a vengeful uprising that would follow an assassination? He was Sir Arthur Dayne, Sword of the Morning, famed across the kingdoms for his unwavering honor and peerless skill. Yet never had he felt so powerless. He carried a great burden now, returning to a mad king with empty hands. Perhaps, he thought, he would say that Robert had vanished into the hinterlands, that he had fled from Storm's End upon hearing rumors of royal assassins. Maybe that would suffice for Ares, who had grown so paranoid that he might believe any rumor if it confirmed his prejudices. If the king demanded more proof, Arthur would be forced to spin further lies. And each lie would weigh heavier on his soul, defying the knightly virtue he cherished. Still, he could not see another way. With each hoofbeat, with each turn of the winding road, he faced the inevitable. He was returning to a court of madness, to a king who might well burn him alive if he suspected betrayal. Yet, between duty and conscience, this was the path Arthur Dayne walked. He might not see his own redemption at the end of it, nor the realm's salvation, but for now, he had at least prevented a murder that felt all too wrong. And so he rode on, the sword dawn hidden beneath his cloak, the legend of the Sword of the Morning obscured by a plain traveling garb. The sky overhead rumbled as new storm clouds gathered, and he breathed in the damp air, feeling the pull of fate. War was coming, yes, and Robert Baratheon would be at its heart. Arthur had left him alive to gather his strength. One day, perhaps soon, they would meet again, and on that day, the realm would tremble, for the tide of history often pivoted on the crossing of swords and the hearts of honorable men. For now, Arthur continued alone, the thunder echoing behind him, the specter of conflict ahead. He had made his choice, standing at the crossroads of loyalty and righteousness, and he would face the consequences with the stoicism that had become the hallmark of his legend. In the gathering gloom, he pressed his horse to a canter, the silhouette of King's Landing faintly visible on the horizon, a city that would soon be the focal point of a war born of secrets, grief, and madness. He murmured a silent prayer to the Seven, begging, perhaps, for a resolution beyond the horrors of a kingdom turned on itself, and for a redemption for knights bound by conflicting oaths. Yet the storm clouds rolled overhead, indifferent, bearing no mercy and no answer, only the electric promise that all storms must eventually break.